The Frankish Kingdom, Clovis and the Birth of Paris. The year is 486. A young man, barely 20 years old, sits on his horse outside the walls of Paris. His name is Clovis. He's a Frank, a Germanic warrior whose people have been moving into Gaul for generations. His father was Childeric, a petty king who ruled a small territory around Tournai in what's now Belgium. But Clovis has bigger ambitions. He's just defeated the last Roman strongman in northern Gaul, a general named Syagrius, who'd been ruling a rump state from Soissons, calling himself King of the Romans, even though the Western Roman Empire had officially ended a decade earlier. Syagrius fled. Clovis had him hunted down and executed. Now Clovis looks at Paris, the island fortress on the Seine, the city that survived the Celts, the Romans, and Germanic raids. The city whose walls were built from stones taken from Roman monuments. The city that doesn't belong to anyone anymore, really. Not to Rome. Rome is gone. Not to the Gallo-Romans who live there. They have no army, no empire to protect. Clovis rides forward, and Paris opens its gates. Welcome back to the Chicano in Paris podcast as we deep dive into the history of Paris. I'm Rudy Martinez. We've traced this city from a Celtic settlement to a Roman provincial town, watched it transform and shrink and survive. Today we're going to watch Paris be reborn under a new people, a new dynasty, and eventually a new faith. This is the story of how a Germanic warlord became a Christian king, how Paris became a capital for the first time, and how the foundations of medieval France were laid on that little island in the Seine. This is the age of the Merovingians, the age of the Franks. Part 1. The Franks arrive. So who were the Franks, and how did they end up ruling Gaul? The Franks were a confederation of Germanic tribes who'd been living along the Rhine frontier for centuries. The Romans knew them well, sometimes as enemies, sometimes as allies, and often as both. Frank warriors served in Roman legions. Frank settlers moved into Roman territory, especially as the empire weakened in the 4th and 5th centuries. The word Frank probably meant something like fierce or free. They spoke a Germanic language, ancestors of modern Dutch and German. They were pagans, worshipping gods like Woden and Donar. They wore their hair long. The Merovingian kings would be called the long-haired kings because cutting one's hair was a sign of giving up royal status. And they were warriors. Frank society valued martial prowess above almost everything else. A man's status came from his skill in battle, his ability to lead other warriors, his success in raids and wars. By the mid-5th century, as the Western Roman Empire collapsed, Frankish groups had established themselves across northern Gaul. They weren't unified. Different Frankish kings ruled different territories, sometimes cooperating, more often competing. There were Salian Franks along the coast, Ripuarian Franks along the Rhine, and various other groups scattered across the landscape. One of these Frankish kings was Childeric, based in Tournai. Childeric was an interesting figure, a Frankish warrior, but also someone who'd worked with Romans. He'd fought alongside Roman generals against other barbarian tribes. He'd been buried, when he died in 481, with a mix of Frankish and Roman grave goods, weapons and jewelry, but also a seal ring with his name in Latin letters. Childeric was living in both worlds. His son Clovis inherited that dual identity, but Clovis would take it much, much further. When Clovis became king in 481, he was about 15 years old. His kingdom was tiny, just the area around Tournai. His army numbered perhaps 500 warriors. Not exactly an impressive start. But Clovis was ambitious and ruthless and politically brilliant. Over the next 30 years, he would unite all Frankish tribes under his rule, conquer most of Gaul, and establish a dynasty that would last for 2.5 centuries. His first major move was against Syagrius. Remember Syagrius, that Roman general ruling from Soissons, clinging to the fiction that he represented Rome even though Rome had fallen? In 486, Clovis marched against him. The battle was at Soissons. Clovis won decisively. Syagrius fled to the Visigoths in the south, but Clovis demanded his surrender, and the Visigoths complied. Syagrius was executed. And just like that, at age 20, Clovis controlled everything from Tournai to the Loire Valley, including Paris. There's a famous story about what happened after the Battle of Soissons. Among the loot taken from Syagrius' territory was a valuable vase from a church, probably a communion vessel or a baptismal font. The bishop whose church had been plundered asked Clovis to return it. Now, Frankish customs said that loot was divided among the warriors. Each man got his share, even the king just got an equal portion, plus first pick. So technically, that vase belonged to whoever drew it in the distribution of spoils. Clovis wanted to return it, partly to keep the bishops happy, and partly because he understood the political value of appearing respectful towards the church. So at the ceremony where the loot was divided, he asked his warriors to let him have the vase in addition to his regular share. Most agreed, but one warrior, apparently harboring some grievance, said no. To make his point, he struck the vase with his battle axe, denting it, and said, "You will have nothing here except what the lot gives you." Clovis said nothing. He took the damaged vase and returned it to the bishop. But the next year, when Clovis was reviewing his troops, he came to that same warrior. Clovis said the man's weapons were poorly maintained. His spear and axe weren't good enough. And then Clovis took the man's axe, threw it on the ground, and when the warrior bent to pick it up, Clovis split his skull with his own axe, saying, "Thus did you do to the vase at Soissons." It's a chilling story, and whether it happened exactly that way or was embellished later, it tells us something important about Clovis. He was patient. He remembered slights, and he was absolutely ruthless when it came to establishing his authority. This was the man who was now master of Paris. Part 2. The Saint and the King. When Clovis entered Paris in 486 or 487, he met someone who would profoundly influence his life and reign. She was an elderly woman, perhaps in her 60s, who had lived through the collapse of Rome and who had faced down Attila the Hun, who had saved Paris from starvation during his father Childric's siege. Her name was Geneviève. We talked about Geneviève in the last episode, how she convinced the people of Paris not to flee when Attila approached, how she brought grain through enemy lines during Childric's blockade. But what we didn't cover was what happened after Childric died and Clovis took power. Clovis, like his father before him, greatly respected Geneviève. According to the sources, primarily her Vita, the biography written not long after her death, Clovis made her his advisor. This elderly nun, this woman who owned nothing, who had no army, no political power in the conventional sense, became one of the most influential people in his courts. Why would a warrior king listen to an old woman? Partly because Geneviève had proved herself. She'd saved Paris twice, from Attila and from starvation. The people loved her, revered her as a living saint. For a new ruler trying to establish legitimacy, having Genevieve's support mattered enormously. But it was more than political calculation. The sources say Clovis venerated her. He granted her every request. And what did Geneviève request? Mercy. Again and again, Geneviève interceded for prisoners condemned to death. Clovis would capture a city, round up those who'd resisted, and prepare to execute them as examples. And Geneviève would ask for their lives. And Clovis, this ruthless warrior who'd split a man's skull over a damaged vase, would pardon them. There's a story that once Clovis ordered the city gates closed specifically to prevent Geneviève from reaching prisoners he intended to execute. But when she arrived at the gates and touched them, they opened without a key. She met with Clovis and convinced him not to carry out the executions. Now, whether that miracle happened or not, the pattern is clear. Geneviève had power over Clovis in a way few others did. She could move his heart toward clemency. And she wasn't alone in this influence. In 493, Clovis married. His bride was Clotilde, daughter of the king of Burgundy, and Clotilde was a devout Christian. Now here's something crucial to understand. Most Germanic tribes by this point had converted to Christianity. The Visigoths in Spain, the Ostrogoths in Italy, the Vandals in North Africa, the Burgundians in southeastern Gaul, all Christian. But they were Arian Christians. Arianism was a Christian heresy. At least that's how the Catholic Christians saw it. Arians believed that Jesus, while divine, was created by God the Father and was therefore subordinate to him. And Catholic Christians believed in the Trinity, the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, as co-equal and co-eternal. This theological distinction might seem minor, but it had huge political implications. The Gallo-Romans population, the descendants of those Romanized Parisi we talked about, were Catholic. The bishops were Catholic. If Clovis converted to Arian Christianity, he'd always be seen as a foreign conqueror, religiously separate from his subjects. But if he converted to Catholic Christianity, the same faith as the Gallo-Romans, he could truly unite his kingdom. And Clotilde understood this. Geneviève understood this. And together, these two women worked on Clovis, urging him to convert. It wasn't easy. Clovis was a pagan. He worshipped the old Germanic gods. His warriors worshipped those gods. Converting meant asking his men to abandon the gods who had brought them victory, to embrace the god of a conquered Gallo-Roman. That was a hard sell. Clotilde convinced Clovis to let her baptize their first son. The child died shortly after baptism. Clovis saw this as proof that the Christian God was weak, that his old gods were angry. He refused to baptize their second son. But then the second son fell desperately ill. Clovis watched his child dying and despaired. And Geneviève prayed. According to tradition, through her prayers, the child recovered. Still, Clovis hesitated. He needed something more, something dramatic, something that would convince not just him but his warriors the Christian God was stronger than the old gods. He got it in a place called Tolbiac. Part 3, The Vow. The year is 496, or possibly 506. Historians still debate the exact date. Clovis has received a call for help from Sigebert the Lame, king of the Ripuarian Franks, whose territory around Cologne is being invaded by the Alemanni, another Germanic confederation. Clovis marches east with his army. The two forces meet at Tolbiac, modern-day Zülpich in Germany, about 60 kilometers east of the present-day German-Belgian border, and the battle is brutal. The Alemanni are fierce warriors. The Franks are taking heavy casualties, and Clovis watches his men falling. The line is breaking, and defeat is staring him in the face. And in that desperate moment, Clovis does something he's never done before. He prays to the Christian God. Our source for this is Gregory of Tours, a bishop who wrote the history of the Franks about a century after these events. Gregory records Clovis's prayer, and whether these are the exact words or not, they capture something profound about the moment. Jesus Christ, whom Clotilde proclaims to be the Son of the living God, who art said to give aid to those in danger, and to bestow victory on those who hope in thee, I beseech the glory of thy aid. If thou shalt grant me victory over these enemies, and I experience the power which people dedicated to thy name say they have experienced, I will believe in thee, and be baptized in thy name. For I have invoked my own gods, but they have withdrawn their favor from me. Therefore I believe that they possess no power. I now call upon thee. I only need to be saved from my adversaries. It's a remarkably pragmatic prayer. Not I believe in you, but if you prove yourself, then I'll believe. A bargain, a deal. Very Frankish, very Clovis. According to Gregory, at that moment the tide of battle turned. The leader of the Alemanni was struck down, killed by an axe according to one account. Seeing their leader fall, the Alemanni began to flee. The Franks pursued them, cutting them down until the Alemanni surrendered. Clovis had won. The Christian God had delivered victory. The story deliberately echoes another famous conversion, Constantine the Great, at the Battle of Milvian Bridge in 312 CE, when Constantine reportedly saw a vision of the cross and heard the words, "In this sign conquer." Gregory of Tours knew this parallel and emphasized it. Clovis was being positioned as a new Constantine, a warrior emperor who would bring Christianity to a pagan people. After the battle, Clovis returned to Paris, and he told Clotilde what he was ready to convert. He told Geneviève, who wept with joy. Her prayers for the king's soul had been answered. But converting wasn't simple. Clovis had to bring his warriors with him. If he converted alone, he risked losing their loyalty. The Franks worshipped the old gods. They believed these gods brought them victory in battle, and how could they abandon them? According to tradition, Bishop Remigius of Reims, who would perform the baptism, provided secret instruction to Clovis. The king needed to understand what he was committing to. Christianity wasn't just another god to add to the pantheon. It was exclusive. One God. The old gods weren't just being set aside. They were being declared false, powerless, demonic even. This was a massive ask. But Clovis had made a vow, and Clovis, whatever else he was, kept his vows. On Christmas Day, traditionally 496, though some historians argue for 498 or even 508, Clovis was baptized in the cathedral at Reims. Picture the scene. The cathedral is packed. Candles flicker. Incense fills the air. Bishop Remigius stands at the baptismal font, and Clovis, the warrior king, the man who'd conquered half of Gaul, the man whose battle axe had split the skulls and settled disputes, kneels like a child before the bishop. Remigius reportedly said to him, "Bow your head humbly, Sicambrian," a Sicambrian being an old name for the Franks. "Adore what you have burned, burn what you have adored." Clovis was immersed 3 times in the water, in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. And when he rose from that font, he was no longer a pagan king. He was a Christian, a Catholic Christian. But Clovis didn't convert alone. According to Gregory of Tours, 3,000 of his warriors were baptized with him. 3,000 men following their king into a new faith. How many were truly convinced? How many converted out of political calculation or loyalty to Clovis or fear of being left behind? We'll never know. But it happened. In a single ceremony, a significant portion of the Frankish warrior aristocracy became Christian. And it wasn't just any Christianity. It was Catholic Christianity, the same faith as the Gallo-Roman bishops, the same faith as the Pope in Rome. Not Arianism, which most other Germanic kingdoms had adopted. This distinction mattered enormously. The Visigoths in Spain, Arian. The Ostrogoths in Italy, Arian. The Burgundians, Arian. But Clovis and the Franks, Catholic. This immediately made Clovis the natural ally of the Catholic Church and the Gallo-Roman population. It gave him a legitimacy that other Germanic kings lacked. Bishop Avitus of Vienne wrote to Clovis congratulating him on his baptism. The letter survives, and it's revealing. Avitus doesn't just praise Clovis's personal conversion. He praises the political wisdom of choosing Catholic over Arian Christianity. He sees this as a masterstroke that would allow Clovis to unite Gaul under his rule. And he was right. Clovis's conversion transformed him from a barbarian conqueror into a legitimate Christian king. The bishops who'd been wary of Frankish rule now became his supporters. The Gallo-Roman aristocracy, which might have resisted, now saw him as one of their own, in faith if not in blood. Clotilde had been right. Geneviève had been right. Conversion wasn't just about personal salvation. It was about power. And Clovis, ever the pragmatist, had understood that perfectly. Part 4. Paris becomes a capital. After his baptism, Clovis continued his conquests. In 507, he marched against the Visigoths, those Arian Christians who had controlled Aquitaine. The battle was at Vouillé, near Poitiers. Clovis won decisively. According to legend, he personally killed the Visigothic king Alaric II in combat. With this victory, Clovis controlled most of Gaul, from Tournai in the north to Toulouse in the south, from the Atlantic to the Rhine. It was the largest kingdom in Western Europe, and Clovis needed a capital worthy of it. He chose Paris. Think about why. Paris wasn't the largest city in his realm. Lyon was bigger and more prosperous. But Paris was centrally located. It was on the Seine, which meant access to northern trade routes. It was defensible. That island fortress had proved its value. And perhaps most importantly, it was Catholic. Paris had Saint Geneviève. It had churches and bishops. It had a Gallo-Roman population that had embraced Christianity centuries earlier. By making Paris his capital, Clovis was making a statement. He wasn't just another barbarian conqueror. He was a Christian king, ruling from a Christian city, heir to Roman tradition as much as Frankish. Around 508, Clovis began building. He'd promised Geneviève before his conversion that he would build a great church in Paris, and now he kept that promise. The church was dedicated to Saints Peter and Paul, the 2 great apostles, the founders of the Christian church. It was built on the Montagne Saint Geneviève, the hill on the left bank where the Roman Forum had once stood, the highest point in Paris, visible from across the city. This was to be Clovis's church, his monument, and eventually his tomb. The construction wasn't finished when Clovis died, on November 27th, 511, though some sources say different dates. Clovis died in Paris. He was about 45 years old. He'd ruled for 30 years. He'd united the Franks and conquered most of Gaul, converted to Christianity, and established a dynasty. His body was laid to rest in the church he'd begun building, the Church of the Holy Apostles, as it was called then. Queen Clotilde oversaw the completion of the construction, and when she died in 545, she was buried beside him. And in 512, just months after Clovis's death, Saint Geneviève died. She was in her 90s, an extraordinary age for the time, and she was buried in the same church near the tomb of the king she had counseled, the king she had helped bring to Christianity. The church was quickly becoming known as Saint Geneviève, Saint Genevieve's church. Miracles were reported at her tomb. Pilgrims came from across Gaul to pray there. The church became one of the most important religious sites in the Frankish kingdom. This is important. Clovis and Geneviève, buried together, represented the fusion that was taking place in Paris. The Germanic warrior king and the Gallo-Roman saint, the conqueror and the holy woman, Frankish power and Christian faith. This was the new identity being forged in the city. Paris was no longer Lutetia, that provincial Roman town. It wasn't the Parisi settlement of the ancient times. It was becoming something new, a Frankish capital, but a Catholic Frankish capital, a city where Germanic and Roman pagan past and Christian present were merging into something that would eventually become French. Clovis had made Paris matter in a way that it hadn't since Julian used it as his winter headquarters 150 years earlier. It was the seat of a king. Decisions made in Paris affected all of Gaul. When Clovis called his bishops to council, as he did in the First Council of Orleans in 511, shortly before his death, they came to help shape the relationship between the Frankish crown and the church. The decrees from that council are revealing. They established that the same laws would apply to Franks and Romans, equality between conquerors and conquered. They regulated church discipline, the duties of the bishops, the right of sanctuary. These weren't just religious matters. They were foundational laws for a new society. For the first time, Paris was helping to shape not just its own future, but the future of the kingdom, of what would become France. Part 5. The Merovingian Legacy. Clovis's death created an immediate problem. He had 4 surviving sons, Theodoric from an earlier relationship, and 3 sons with Clotilde, Clodomir, Childebert, and Clothar. In Frankish tradition, the kingdom wasn't inherited by the eldest son. It was divided among all the sons. Each got an equal share, or as equal as could be managed. So in 511, the Frankish kingdom was partitioned. Theodoric got territory in the east, around the Rhine and Moselle rivers, ruling from Reims. Clodomir got the Loire country in the center of Gaul, ruling from Orleans. Childebert got the Channel coast and Lower Seine, including Paris. Clothar got the old Frankish heartland north of the Somme, ruling from Soissons. This partition seems insane to us. Why deliberately fragment a kingdom you just unified? But for the Franks, it made sense. All the sons were royal, all had a right to rule, and all deserved a share of their father's kingdom. The problem, of course, was that this created 4 kings, each ambitious, each wanting more. And the Frankish solution to wanting more was usually violence. The brothers cooperated sometimes. They jointly conquered Burgundy in 534, finally bringing that kingdom fully under Frankish control. But they also plotted against each other. They murdered rivals, including their own nephews. When Clodomir died in battle in 524, his 3 young sons should have inherited his kingdom. Instead, their uncles Childebert and Clothar lured the boys to Paris, murdered 2 of them, actual children, and divided Clodomir's kingdom between themselves. The 3rd son, Clodewald, escaped and became a monk, giving up all claims to royalty. We know him now as Saint Cloud. This was Merovingian politics. Ruthless, bloody, family meant little when power was at stake. Eventually, through death and consolidation, the kingdom was reunited. By 558, only Clothar was left alive of Clovis's sons. For 3 years, he ruled a united Frankish kingdom from Paris, which he'd taken from his brother Childebert. But when Clothar died in 561, the kingdom was divided again amongst his 4 sons, and the cycle continued. Division, war, occasional reunification, and more division. This was the pattern of Merovingian rule for the next 2 centuries. The dynasty Clovis founded, the Merovingians, named after his semi-legendary grandfather Merovac, would rule until 751. But the later Merovingian kings were shadows of Clovis. They were called the Do-Nothing Kings, puppets controlled by powerful officials called mayors of the palace. Real power slipped from their hands. In 751, the last Merovingian king, Childeric III, was deposed by his mayor of the palace, Pepin the Short. Pepin founded a new dynasty, the Carolingians. His son would be Charlemagne, who would build an empire greater than any Merovingian had dreamed. But that's a story for another episode. What matters for Paris is what Clovis established. He made Paris a royal city. Kings would come and go, dynasties would rise and fall, but Paris would remain important. It wouldn't always be the capital. Under later Merovingians, multiple capitals existed simultaneously, but it was always one of the key cities of the Frankish realm. The church Clovis built, the church of Saints Peter and Paul, where he and Geneviève were buried, became a major pilgrimage site and a center of learning. In the early Middle Ages, the Abbey of Saint Geneviève was one of the most important monasteries in France. Kings and nobles gave it land and wealth. Scholars studied there. It was a beacon of faith and knowledge. That church stood for over 1,000 years. It was damaged by Viking raids in the 9th century and rebuilt. It stood through the Middle Ages. When it finally fell into decay in the 18th century, King Louis XV ordered a new church built in its honor, the magnificent building designed by architect Jacques-Germain Soufflot. But before the new church could be dedicated, the French Revolution erupted. In 1791, the National Assembly voted to transform it into a mausoleum for distinguished French citizens. They called it the Pantheon, after the Pantheon in Rome. The revolutionaries in 1793 did something terrible. They took Saint Geneviève's relics from her shrine, put them on trial, on trial, and burned them. They scattered her ashes in the Seine. They were destroying the past, or trying to. Clovis's tomb had already been destroyed centuries earlier, possibly during the Viking raids, possibly during later construction. His remains may have been moved to Saint-Denis, the royal basilica, or they may simply have been lost. We don't know. So the first king to make Paris his capital, and the saint who saved Paris from Attila, are both gone. Their bones are dust. Their church is now a secular monument. But their legacy remains. Paris is the capital of France, because Clovis made it so. The fusion of Germanic and Roman, of warrior culture and Christian faith that they represented became the foundation of French identity. Picture Paris in the year 550. 40 years after Clovis's death, the island fortress is crowded with buildings. The church on the Montagne Saint Geneviève dominates the skyline. Pilgrims climb the hill to pray at Geneviève's tomb. In the royal palace, one of Clovis's sons, Childebert or Clothar, holds court, making decisions that affect all of Gaul. The language you hear in the streets is changing. Still Latin, but it's evolving. Germanic words are creeping in. The pronunciation is shifting. In a few centuries, this won't be Latin anymore. It will be Old French. The people are changing too. Franks and Gallo-Romans are intermarrying. The rigid distinctions are blurring. A new people is emerging, neither Roman nor Germanic, but something in between, something new. And the city has a new name, or at least an old name reasserted. Not Lutetia, but Paris, the name of that Celtic tribe that lived here 1,000 years ago, that gave their name to the place and then disappeared into history. That name has come back, and it will last. Paris has been many things. A Celtic settlement, a Roman provincial town, a fortified refuge in a collapsing empire, and now a Frankish capital, a Christian city, a place where the future of a kingdom is being decided. Over the next 1,000 years, Paris will grow It will expand beyond the island and beyond old Roman walls. It will build great cathedrals and universities. It will become the city of light, the cultural capital of Europe, one of the great cities of the world. But all of that starts here, with a Celtic tribe called the Parisii, with a Roman city called Lutetia, with a saint named Geneviève who refused to abandon her city, and with a Frankish king named Clovis who made this city his capital and bound it to Christianity forever. The foundations are laid. The rest is still to come. In the next episode, the early Middle Ages, Viking raids that terrorized the city, and the rise of the Capetian dynasty that will finally bring stability, and the beginning of Paris's transformation into a medieval metropolis, a center of learning, commerce, and faith. Thank you all for listening.